It's also my complete honour today to introduce Padma Raman, Executive Director of Office for Women in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Now, when I asked her what she wanted to be introduced as, she said, "Don't do that," but I will be doing that. Padma is deeply cool. She is the Executive Director of the Office for Women, and before joining the OFW in September 2023, she was Chief Executive Officer of Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety Limited, ANROS, and where she spearheaded their deeply impressive intersectional research and their nuanced understandings of violence and what it looks like in Australia. In her time as CEO, she established ANROS as a widely recognised leading authoritative voice on evidence and opportunities to end violence against women and their children. Before she started as CEO of ANROS, she was also the Chief Executive at the Australian Human Rights Commission for 11 years. Prior to that, she was also the Chief Executive Officer at Victorian Law Reform Commission for 9 years and served as part-time Commissioner for the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission for 5 years. So deeply impressive, and is also a wonderful person besides. Thank you so much.
The reason I didn't want to be introduced is because that makes me sound really old, which I am, finally. Can I start by acknowledging that we are on unceded Aboriginal land and pay my deep respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, pay my deep respects to elders past and present. As a migrant woman to this country, I think it's particularly, I find welcomes to country such a beautiful act of grace, and I can't believe it. I come from a country where independence from the coloniser was an important part of our identity, and I just find welcomes to country so generous, given that land has been unceded. I do have a written speech, but I might ditch that. I made a big effort to be here today, partly to pay tribute to Helen and her work, and to be with you all. I recognise that this is the last hurrah for ERA in its current form, and I really wanted to be here in person. What I want to do today is really talk a little bit about the strategy, which you're all probably familiar with, but also to think about what we do with it together, what we do with it in the next 10 years and how we genuinely collaborate, how civil society genuinely collaborates with government to make possible what the Minister calls the to-do list that's working for women. So I have been in the role since September, so not very long, and I've never been inside the machine before, inside the beast. I have been a public servant when I was at the Human Rights Commission, but being inside, and I thought I knew all about government, but being inside is truly different, and I'm still learning the acronyms, still learning how government works. And people have asked me why I made that shift. And I made this shift very deliberately because I think we're in a moment of time that we have to seize upon. When we were at CSW with the Minister, you'd hear this gasp when the Minister would say she's the Minister for Finance and also the Minister for Women and also the Minister for Public Service and also the Minister for Data. And those four things were a very deliberate putting together by this government to say gender equality really matters and is central to every decision that government makes. And it wasn't just, it didn't feel like just lip service, and I definitely, being inside, know that it's not. It's a genuine commitment from the Prime Minister down to recognising that unless we think about how things affect all genders as we're making decisions, we're never going to make good public policy. So the Office for Women is 50 this year, and it's an interesting, it's had a long and interesting journey over that time, waxing and waning depending on different ministers and different governments. But And Susan Ryan, who was the first Minister for the Status of Women, who set up the Office for Women 50 years ago, would say that she came up with the first strategy, gender equality strategy. There was a statement that the Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, made at the time on women's equality. But it was a statement, it wasn't a strategy. And what we have now is a strategy which you might think I'm biased, but I think it's fairly sophisticated because it recognises that to get to gender equality, we need to work on a whole range of things. We need to start by understanding that gender stereotypes and norms underpin everything, that every system and every part of the way our society works. But upon that foundation, we need to recognise that we need to work on ending violence against women, thinking about women's paid and unpaid care, thinking about women's economic security, thinking about women's health, and working on women's representation in decision-making and leadership before we can get to gender equality. So it's not that gender inequality leads to those things, it is that those things are things that we need to work on to reach gender equality. And I think the most powerful part of the strategy is not just in the government telling us what it's done, but the things that the government tells us it's committed to doing. And I think that's the hook for civil society, to keep us accountable, to keep people in the office and in government accountable to the things we say we will do in the future. And one of the things I think that's really important about the mechanics of the strategy and how it will be implemented is through gender responsive budgeting. And once again, Australia was a leader back in 1983 in introducing gender responsive budgeting. And it was one of those things that Susan Ryan, who was a pioneer, who was such an amazing feminist, who saw the horizon, and Helen was talking about how we need to be looking at the horizon. Susan was clearly someone who could do that. And she didn't just implement CEDAW through the Sex Discrimination Act, she also introduced gender responsive budgeting as part of the architecture, as part of how governments can actually think about gender in implementing all decisions. And gender responsive budgeting, again, has had an interesting history, but was of course abandoned in 2013 and reintroduced by this government. And we've just had the first full cycle of where every proposal that went to Cabinet had to have a gender analysis or a gender impact assessment. And I'll be frank, I think there's a long way to go in terms of raising capacity. We've had 10 years of a public sector that hasn't been used to doing this, and we at the office have to raise that capacity. It's very clear from our minister that she's not expecting the office, where we're 60 people, to be doing the gender analysis across government. It is government departments' responsibility to do that work with the help of the office. So we're seeing steady improvement, but there's a long way to go in terms of getting the public sector to use that tool in a way that's not just about compliance, but to really think about how does policy affect all genders and women in particular. And I think it's fair to say some of the most impressive gender analysis came with the redesign of the tax cuts, where it was clear that the aim to make women's lives better, which is actually what, when I first met the minister upon taking up my role and I asked her what my KPIs were, she said, just make women's lives better. And I think that's a really interesting framing because she is all about practical change in the lives of women. So gender responsive budgeting is a really important tool that we have that we need to keep refining. And I think it's also a really interesting lens for people in civil society to be thinking about in your engagement with government. It is something that all departments have to engage with any proposal, and for us the challenge is not just to be thinking about it when a proposal comes up before government or to cabinet, but at the very start. So how do we get that thinking into how ideas are even thought about. Getting that thinking really early is a challenge for the office, and I guess one of the things that the Minister did with creating my role, so my role is for the first time, I find hierarchy really difficult, but I have to, within the public sector, you have to accept that it exists and use the power that you have. This is the most senior this role has ever been in its 50 years. And again, that was deliberate. It was done to try and elevate the office and to increase its influence across the public sector. So gender-responsive budgeting is a tool that we really need to lean in on in thinking about how we ensure that considerations of gender, and not just gender. I mean, when I came in, it was very clear, and I was pleased to see that the office already had a very good intersectional understanding. And I've always felt that if you get things right for the most marginalised, you get things right for everybody. One of the most, I've come from ANROS, and I'm deeply committed to thinking about how we end violence against women and children. And the Prime Minister this year at his International Women's Day breakfast that he does every year to Parliament at the start of the year, it's usually in the same week as the Closing the Gap speech, made a very bold speech, and if you haven't read it, it's worth reading. His speech focused purely on violence against women, and he said we need to do more and we need to do better, and we need to think about whether we need to do things differently because the dial isn't shifting. And unfortunately, we've seen an increase in women being murdered by intimate partners or former partners in the start of this year. And for the first time, well, maybe not the first time, Rosie Batty brought a lot of attention to this back in 2013 and 2014. But we've had media interest for the first time since that time. And it's as if for the media this problem never existed before. But again, we need to seize that moment, the moment where there is public attention. And I think the National Cabinet that met on the 1st of May was an indication of how governments are starting to take this very seriously. That National Cabinet, which I was lucky enough to be at, was interesting because there was a unified, and again, it didn't feel like lip service, there was a unified sense of we need to do things, we need to think about whether what we're doing is enough, we need to think about whether there are innovative solutions that we haven't thought of, because the problem isn't getting better. And if you look at crime rates, most crimes are in fact, despite what the community might think, are dropping, but violence against women is one that's stubbornly increasing. And that might be because we haven't reached the threshold of even knowing what the prevalence rates really are. But what we can see is a steady increase in reporting, and that might be because there's increasing trust in a system that's still not working for women, but also that there is an epidemic level of violence against women in this country. Not just family and domestic violence, but sexual violence. And the systems that try and respond to these things are deeply flawed in the way that they don't work for women. And one of the really interesting things when I started and talking to the Minister about what the strategy actually was, because they had an election platform to have a gender equality strategy, but what did that mean? And I think at the office we were really trying to work out whether it was a strategy for all genders, and over discussions with the Minister, she finally said, no, I think it's a strategy for women, because the Equality Project has historically failed women. And so the title Working for Women, again, is very deliberate, recognising that if you improve the lives of women, and if you work on that, it is going to improve the lives of all Australians and all genders. And it recognises that men too are limited by the stereotypes and norms that are foundational to the lack of gender equity and gender inequality. And that's one of the things that National Cabinet discussed. So there were, as you would see, there was some tasking, again, this is a government word that I've learned, tasking, that came out of National Cabinet, which basically means things that need to be done by governments, one of which was the setting up of the rapid review, which is, despite what everyone might think it was basically meant to be a group of people with different expertise, multidisciplinary expertise, to just very quickly look at the evidence that's existed, not to take away from anything that's been done, but to look at the evidence and say, is there something we've missed? Is there things that we're not knitting together? Are there things that we can be accelerating? Are there pockets of good practice that we need to be shining a light on and expanding to scale? Is it place-based thing? I mean, we know that there are pockets of great practice, and we know that there are things that have shifted the dial. What are those things, and how do we highlight them? I had a really interesting exchange at Senate Estimates with, it's on the public record, with Senator Colbeck, who, for whom this was suddenly like a revelation, like he'd never come across this problem before. He said he'd been to his local Rotary Club and someone had disclosed violence to him, and he was shocked because it was someone he knew, and he had never expected that someone like her would have experienced violence. And that same day he went to his golf club, and he was standing amongst a group of men, and one of the men said something deeply inappropriate. He thought it was inappropriate about women. And he said in both instances he had no idea what to do. And he was genuinely asking for help in terms of what does he didn't say this, but as a white man in his 60s who goes to the two whitest, malest institutions and confronts this thing that he finds he can't even talk about. You know, it's uncomfortable. It's something that he doesn't think happens in his community. And I went back to the NCAS statistics, which says that 91% of Australians think that violence is a serious problem, but only 47% of people think it happens in their backyard. So there's this, we still have a huge, we still need to make huge efforts to get this country to understand what a serious problem it is. When you talk to police, and in Queensland, it's 80% of call-outs that are domestic violence, and that has to be physical violence. We're not even talking about coercive control or emotional abuse or financial abuse. We're talking about police call-outs. And these are things that the community doesn't know, that our resources as governments are taken up with something that's so basic, that women are not safe. They're not safe in their homes. They're not safe. That lack of safety at home carries through in everything we do. We genuinely do not feel safe. And that is still something that people find, especially men, do not understand in this community. Having said that, one of the things I was trying to say about National Cabinet was there were a whole range of things that they talked about. So there are some concrete things that are underway. And I do wake up in the middle of the night feeling slightly nauseous, thinking about how many tracks we've laid down and how much has to come together in 3 months. So we've got pieces of work with police ministers and SCAG, the Standing Committee of Attorneys General, looking at police responses, because one of the things that we know is, especially when we're looking at murdered women and murdered domestic homicides, it's again and again and again we see coronial inquests that show police inaction or police not taking a situation seriously, or police not implementing the laws that we have. There are no laws that are not strong enough around the country. When we keep getting told that bail laws need to be stronger. No, they don't. They just need to be implemented. So there is this. There is a lot more that we need to do around police responses, and that's something that state and territory governments are working on. We're also looking at how state and territory governments can have a consistent understanding of high-risk perpetrators. We once again know we've got serial offenders in our community living amongst us who not just perpetrate violence against one woman, but serially perpetrate violence against many women. And we know who these men are, and we need to do more about making sure that we have eyes on them and we keep them accountable. So all these pieces of work need to come together, but one of the things that was very clear about how we approach this work is that we need to bring men along. We need to think about what the Gender Equality Project is doing in terms of backlash, because it certainly there certainly is backlash, and we as feminists, as people working together, need to think about that backlash and prepare for that backlash. We are, as someone said before, it is about power, it is about sharing power, it is about shifting power, and with that means people losing power. And with that comes that backlash, and I think we have to be very, very cognizant of that backlash. And even the men on the rapid review panel, many of whom have lived experience, feel unsafe talking about their experiences of violence. And I think there is something that we need to do in shifting the ways in which we talk about violence against women and recognise that there's opportunities for prevention at every point of intervention. At every point of intervention that a woman seeks support or a man seek support from services. On the rare occasions that they do, there's an opportunity for prevention. I've wandered all over the place, haven't I? But I guess my fundamental message is we are at a moment of time, and I've been around for long enough to know they don't happen very often. And this moment of time might not last for very long. And we need to seize upon it. We need to seize upon it because there is an authorising environment within government. There are governments right around the country, and especially the federal government, that is committed to making gender central to decision making. And I think there is this moment where we have a government that wants to hear the voices of civil society, that wants to work genuinely in collaboration. And there's a recognition that we will not achieve gender equality unless everyone is part of this journey, unless we as governments work alongside civil society, work alongside business, work alongside the community to have a much more sophisticated conversation. And one of the things I've been reflecting on, since the 80s, we've almost tried to simplify the message. And I think about this especially in the context of violence against women. We've tried to simplify it to make it about something that people can understand, and so we've reduced it to gender inequality. But violence against women is so much more complex. Of course, gender inequality is a driver, but there are other drivers as well. And I think we're at a time where we can start to bring back the complexity into understanding how we get to that point of equality. We have to recognise the interconnectedness of those things that I talked about in the strategy, the interconnectedness of working on violence against women, working on thinking about how our structures and systems are deeply baked in patriarchy and how we dismantle them, how we think about the systems that we live in and how those systems are so capable of perpetuating inequality and perpetuating systems abuse, and how we dismantle those structures and systems. So I guess in this time when we're looking at the horizon, I would just say trust working with government. There are people inside who are genuinely committed to working with and in collaboration with not just civil society, but centering voices of lived experience in all that we do, and let's work together to reach that feminist ideal. Thank you.
Will everyone join me again in a massive thank you to Padma. Thank you for your eloquence and your work and the significant effort that you took to be here and also to rock up in ERA's brand colours. The suit is amazing. And thank you also for tasking us, as those of us in the room, with some really important calls to hold government accountable, to seize upon this authorising environment and work in genuine collaboration. And also to recognise the genuine commitment that government has at the moment to considering gender across all policy areas. Thank you. We've got a brilliant panel coming up next that I think, to Padma, to your quote from the Prime Minister around we need to do more, we need to do better, and perhaps we need to do things differently, is a really beautiful link to our next panel around the future of human rights in Australia.